Namaste everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host kushalmehra. So today we're going to be discussing a very specific paper. For those who don't know, this paper is co-authored by Karan Bhasin and Surjit as Bhalla. This was released in March 2025, and the title of the paper is Four Facts on Inclusive Growth in India. So I'm going to be talking with one of the authors today, Karan Bhasin. Karan, क्या हाल है? कैसा है? सब ठीक है?
बढ़िया सर, थैंक यू सो मच फॉर हैविंग मी। आप बताओ, हाउ आर यू डूइंग?
एकदम बढ़िया है यार। अभी फाइनल के लिए वेट कर रहे हैं चैंपियंस ट्रॉफी की। फिर पाकिस्तानी स्पेस में जाएंगे और लुत्फ उठाएंगे। देखो, इंडिया हारी भी जाएंगे, इंडिया जीती तो भी जाएंगे। क्योंकि मजा सिर्फ उधर ही होता किधर नहीं होता।
बेचारे होस्ट कर रहे थे एंड फाइनल बाहर हो गया उन, मतलब लाइक आई थिंक दिस इज द फर्स्ट टाइम दिस हैज हैपेंड,
हैशटैग
राइट?
यस, हैशटैग सैड लाइफ, हैशटैग सैड
सो
लाइफ। बट ठीक है। सो करण, बिफोर आई गेट इनटू द डिटेल्स ऑफ द पेपर, I had two, three fundamental questions that may not make sense to you as someone who teaches now, but it's very important for people who are going to be listening to this. Okay, two, three terms that on inclusive growth in India. Now, this is such a loaded term because nobody knows what inclusive growth actually means. What is the definition of inclusive growth? How do we actually earmark what qualifies as inclusive growth? So let's first start over there. Let's set the baseline first. What did you guys mean when you guys were talking about inclusive growth?
inclusive growth is kind of like a motherhood statement in at least common parlance, right? Because people talk about growth and like they say that we need to aspire for inclusive growth, but there's no very well laid out specified kind of definition of it per se that comes to mind of people when you actually hear that term. And in our work, when we kind of look at inclusive growth, what we really care about is how is the benefit of growth kind of distributed, right? Like what are the distribution implications of growth? So it's possible for a lot of economies to grow at a very high pace, and at the same time that benefit of growth goes a lot to the top, or rather the upper tail of the income distribution, or to the rich. So when we talk about inclusive growth, essentially what we want to ensure is that the process that creates growth is such that even the poor benefit, and that inequality in some sense can at least not increase as a result of that growth. And if it can decrease, that's even better. So that's what you want to achieve. You want to create a system where economic growth is kind of high and the benefits of it reach all sections of society and do not unfairly go either to the very top, or people at the upper tail of the income distribution. And it's also important to have that kind of growth, because over the last several kind of years, there's been a lot of work on this subject, which shows that if a low income country has to successfully become rich, it needs to sustain a very high growth rate, and sustaining it for longer periods of time. So most countries are able to grow fast, but most countries are not able to sustain that fast growth for a very long period of time. And the difference between countries that are able to sustain that growth versus countries that don't sustain that growth is inequality. So if you have lower inequality, you are more likely to have a longer high growth spell. And that means that you're more likely to transition from a low income to a middle, and then an upper middle, and eventually a high income status. So that's why we kind of do care about redistribution of benefits, and the distribution that is created as an outcome of the growth process.
All right, fine. Now let's get into the paper. So you guys have looked at, so I'm reading directly from the paper. Contrary to the popular perception, there is strong evidence that India has experienced a sharp reduction in inequality over the last 12 years, 2011-12 to 2023-24. An immediate policy implication of the low prevalence of poverty is the need for an updated official poverty line. Now, why have you guys used so I want you to now explain what are the data sets that you guys had used, why did you use them, and then what kind of processes did you apply when you were analyzing the data sets, and then we will get into the conclusions.
So in a sense that this has been the standard practice for poverty calculations in India, is that we have the household consumption expenditure survey. That is the survey that has been used for estimating poverty, for all poverty estimates that have come out of India historically. So that is the only data set that everyone uses. So that's what we use. And after 2011-12, we didn't have a survey. I mean, we did do a survey in 2017-18, but that was basically kind of not made public because of data quality issues. So what happened was that the NSS, which is the sample survey organization, they decided to do two surveys in 2022 and 2023. So they did two surveys back to back to see what they get. And in this paper, we analyzed data from the 23-24 survey. So if you remember last year, we also had a similar paper which analyzed data from the 22-23 survey. So in effect, what we have here is basically an update to the previous year's paper using the latest available survey round, which allows us to get to a poverty estimate, which is kind of like, more up to date and more recent. Uh, so that's like the data on consumption expenditures. The second thing that you actually need to arrive at poverty estimates are poverty line. So once you know ki bhai, how much money you're spending, then you need a poverty line to see who's below that threshold, and that's how you identify someone who's poor and non-poor. And there we have a series of problems because we had the official Tendulkar poverty line, which was very low even in 2011. For those of you who remember, when the Planning Commission came up with that poverty line, 32 rupees and 27 rupees in urban and rural areas per day, it was heavily criticized because people said that, can you actually realistically live at 32 rupees a day in an urban area or a rural area? And that even at that poverty line, you had like something like 12% poverty in 2011-12. So the Planning Commission then set up the Rangarajan Commission, which basically was supposed to revise and come up with an official poverty line. And the Rangarajan Commission did come up with an official poverty with a poverty line, but somehow that was never made an official poverty line since we didn't have the 17-18 survey. So in effect, what we had was that we had these two domestic poverty lines, the Tendulkar and the Rangarajan poverty line. And then you have the World Bank poverty lines, which used to be 1.9 and 3.2. And sometime in 2022, they revised it to a bit higher. So now you have slightly higher poverty lines from the World Bank. So those are like the four international poverty lines. And essentially, what we find is no matter what poverty line you use, uh, poverty levels are significantly lower in 2023 than they were in 2011. And that necessitates a need for a new official poverty line that comes out of India. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened, even though it's essentially Niti Aayog's mandate to set up a new committee to form a new poverty line. But this entire debate on poverty in India post 2011 has seen no participation from Niti either directly or indirectly. So it's kind of sad that we have to come up with an alternate poverty line simply because uh, the statistical kind of responsibility which lies with Niti Aayog has not been fulfilled by them, and they haven't provided us with an official poverty line.
So why do you think? Why is the Niti Aayog reluctant to do that? Just trying
I,
to.
I I don't know. I mean, ordinarily, or what has been the practice in the past is that the moment a survey comes out, there's an expert group that is formed that tries to kind of, estimate a poverty line. And then based on that, you do poverty calculations for the present survey and the previous survey. Now, why that simple exercise has not been done, I don't know. I know that Niti Aayog now has this new poverty measure called the multi-dimensional poverty index, and even that has its own bag of worms. That index was created only because we didn't have 2017-18 survey. So I maybe they just want to promote that and not do this. But historically, You don't have multidimensional poverty index measures available before 2004 anyway. Even 2004 is a questionable, uh, sort of estimate that you can get. So what you have is that if you want to use MDPI, which is what Niti, and Niti's MDPI is very different than how other countries do it. So that's another issue, because you cannot really compare Niti's measure with what's happening elsewhere. So first off, we cannot do any historical comparisons with that measure, and we cannot do any international comparisons with that measure. So why are we still using that? I don't know. And it is not that that shows a better result. If you really want a good result, use these domestic and international poverty lines, and then you see a very sharp decline anyway. So it's not that they want to show a lower poverty that they're using MDPI, but it's
I
just
just think
something that,
the bureaucratic class must be thinking हमारा number better है.
मतलब for some reason ki this has a much more kind of broader definition. So this is better, but it might be better now. But let's say ki 10 saal baad you have given universal access to sanitation and everything, all those components. Then what do you do? Do you say that you don't have any poor anymore? That's not what it is. You'll always have someone who will have less relative to others. So by definition, even though you can eliminate poverty at a particular poverty line, but that just really means that you need to increase the poverty line so that you have a much more broader now definition of poor. I'll
Yeah.
give you an example. Abhi US mein there's this talk about making car payments tax deductible. So if you
Mhm.
buy a car, you take a loan, the payment you make would now potentially, there's a proposal to make that tax deductible. The reason is because that is treated as an essential item over here. So if you don't have a car, technically you can make a case that someone who does not have a car in the US could be defined as being poor. But you cannot make that case in India today. But let's say
Mm.
by 2060 India becomes a developed country. That would deem to be the definition of being poor. So the definition of being poor is also dependent on the way a society is and how developed a society is.
Got it. But in many ways, isn't this a problem with most countries, right? Where I think a lot of this is also an ideological difference, where people would want to think that a let's say a lot of these definitional issues are also ideological, in the sense that what I'm trying to explain is that let's say somebody leans towards free market capitalism, they might want to have a different definition of poverty. Somebody that leans to socialism, they might have a different definition of poverty. Also, the whole problem with analyzing inequality is that there is the entire debate. I actually did see a debate where uh, Shamika ji, Shamika Ravi, एंड हु इज दैट गाय, वो फ्रेंच आदमी, मैं उसका नाम ही भूल गया अभी, जो सारी दुनिया की इनइक्वालिटी को स्टडी करता रहता है.
Piketty.
पिकेटी, 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 ठीक है, टोमास पिकेटी, वो बंदा. और ही तो थिंक्स एवरीथिंग इज हेवायर इन द वर्ल्ड, राइट? नाउ he would disagree with your report. So he would say, so what is your answer to somebody like Thomas Piketty?
So Piketty would probably say that you're missing the rich in this survey. Because let's say that you have someone who's a billionaire and a person goes, a NSS officer goes and says कि भाई मुझे बताओ कि तुमने पिछले महीने नमक कितना खरीदा, या पिछले 7 दिन में नमक कितना खरीदा, पिछले पिछले 1 महीने में क्या-क्या स्पेंड करा वगैरह. The guy is not gonna respond. He'll probably not even open the door. So that's his kind of explanation for why this is happening. My point is, yes, you do miss out some people at the top, right? And but you, how is it any different from 2011 or 1980s? You would still be missing out them. And essentially, I don't care about what's going on, say at the top 1% of the distribution, as long as I get a realistic top 10% or at least 90% of like the consumption expenditures kind of accurately captured in the survey. I can say for a vast majority, inequality has declined. And that's what basically we kind of refrain ourselves from. We say that, look, consumption expenditures key distribution is this, and based on this distribution, this is what we find on inequality. And there's another element over here as well. Let's say that you become a billionaire. How much really can you increase your consumption expenditures, realistically speaking? You cannot increase your food expenditures significantly. After you become a upper middle class household, your food expenditures are not going to go up. They are very likely to actually go down, uh, because you'll be very conscious about how many calories you're consuming and stuff like that. At least the quantity would go down, even if you kind of go to organic stuff and stuff like that. So, long story short, essentially for the vast majority of folks, consumption expenditures and these surveys adequately capture what's going on the distribution, and that's where you see a decline in inequality. It's also interesting because the last particular decade did not see that stellar kind of growth that you saw during the mid 2000s and early 2000s. So that's another interesting point, because you've kind of seen a decline in inequality at a slightly lower growth rate, and at the same time a sharper decline in poverty, which means inherently the growth process has gone more to the bottom rather to the top. And if you look at the 2023 survey, you see that top का तो खैर decline हो रहा है consumption expenditure as per the survey. So essentially we have hit a point where, uh, what I would say is that most people in the middle and lower middle class are now witnessing a saturation of their consumption towards their basic needs, and therefore they're willing to kind of spend more on their non-basic needs a little bit. So that transition has just started to happen, and because of that transition you do see a slight reduction in inequality as measured through this survey.
Okay, now in your paper, you guys have written the recently released HCES 2022-23 and 23-24 surveys allow us to examine four persistent beliefs about poverty and inequality in India. One, extreme poverty levels continue to remain high in India. Two, not much decrease in poverty
low
over the last
low
decade.
low acha nahi, sorry, you're talking about the persistent beliefs.
Yeah.
Okay,
Three,
yeah.
non-comparability of new HCES surveys, and four, widening inequality of India. Again, how do you base that these four can be actively assessed on the basis of these surveys?
Essentially, poverty and inequality estimates have always come from these surveys, right? So anytime you want to analyze these two measures, you have to go and look at these data. And prior to the release of these two surveys, the last survey we had was for 2011. So you had this entire debate on what's happening on poverty in India because you really didn't have data. Now that we do have data, we can kind of come to a reasonable conclusion so as to what has happened, and also put an end to the debate. So if you remember, when we spoke a couple of years ago, the debate actually happened because of two working papers that originated from the US. One was the IMF working paper, and one was the World Bank working paper. And that basically started this entire debate, because one of them said that it's at 10%, the other guy said it's at 2% if you exclude subsidy benefits. And now that you actually do have data, you can actually see whether it's at 10% and 2%, and turns out it's actually at 2%. And we have that chart, figure one, in this paper, and we also had it in the previous paper, where you can actually see how close that uh, estimate was to the original kind of paper that we had. But more importantly, the authors of the other paper recently published their paper in a journal, and they conclude that their estimates are in agreement with what we have. So, in other words, the other side of the debate now basically is agreeing that they're able to get estimates which are in line with what we have. So that kind of settles the debate on what has happened to extreme poverty in India. On inequality, there's again there's bunch of literature that has come out in recent years from India. On one side, you have Piketty, etc., who do their own thing. They don't really look at consumption distributions, and at least these two surveys, I don't think they have really looked at yet. So what they have is, basically based on whatever they're doing, which is not really based on these two surveys. So it's, once they incorporate this in their data set, they might get something completely different. Uh, and then there's also this paper that came out which used CMIE data, which is not Government of India data. And even the CMIE data says that inequality has declined in India. So essentially, you have these two very different data sources which are all pointing towards the same thing, that relatively well off people are not maybe doing that well, and that probably shrinking the inequality in India.
So basically, India is becoming more unfriendly for rich people.
I wouldn't say more unfriendly towards rich people, but I would say that there is certainly a decline in some sense for certain comfortable people. Let's put it like that, because I don't think rich people are captured in this survey.
Okay. But then, like, define comfortable. That's a very vague answer.
Comfortable is anyone who's not a billionaire.
अरे यार comfortable तो बहुत comfortable तो यार एक फकीर भी comfortable हो सकता है. That being comfortable is actually it's a perception based thing, right? It's in the
Yeah,
it's in the
well,
mind of the person.
think of it in terms of movie, right? There's this line कि फैमिली वेल्दी है बट नहीं, मैं कंफर्टेबल हूँ बट बच्चे वेल्दी खिला सकते हैं टाइप्स. Basically. So that's what basically comfortable means. Essentially, it means that you're in the upper middle class category, which is a very vague and a very broad term, because essentially, if you ask anyone in NCR or Bombay, etc., you'd find a lot more people who would be driving, very expensive cars, and they would say that they're comfortable but not rich.
Okay. I understand. Look, there is a sweet spot as far as income is concerned, where they say that when you start making the equivalent of, I think, anything between 80,000 US to 110,000 US
Mm.
per annum, is when you reach the sweet spot where you pretty much have a decent life. I think currently it might have gone up to 120,000, where
Mm.
you stop getting happy post that. There is a
Right.
limit to the happiness quotient. So I'm assuming what you call comfort is a subset of happiness.
For
So,
most people, yeah. For some
right?
people, even that's not enough. So it's
Fair
it's
enough.
very subjective. But in aggregate, how many people would really be getting that as a proportion of the entire population?
Hmm.
I think the bigger issue is that because we've had so many people get college degrees, that the premium that people used to get from education has drastically gone down. So now you have folks who became engineers, and their parents were engineers, they did well in their life, and incidentally, last 15-20 years, you would find that the starting salary of engineers has broadly been unchanged.
Hmm.
There's an oversupply problem. In fact, Gurgaon mein, there's this joke that TCS employees probably earn less than domestic help, starting employees.
Hmm.
So that's also an interesting dynamic that's at play right now. If you think about this from the distribution standpoint, clearly it means that folks who would be otherwise comfortable, or whose parents would be otherwise comfortable, are not really seeing a significant increase in their starting wage relative to unskilled workers. And if you do have a higher wage growth of unskilled workers relative to skilled workers, you would see wage inequality kind of go down. And I think a lot of those dynamics are also at play over the last at least decade that's been at play in the Indian economy.
Hmm. Now, some of the three findings I'm talking about, uh, that you have shown. I'm going to put up table 5 here. Um, Table 5 is where you guys show the non-traditional definitions of poverty in India, right? That is
Yeah.
where that is the main table that we need to talk about, right? And then maybe you can explain it to the viewers. Okay, go ahead and explain what is being mentioned over here.
So, as I said, we don't have a new poverty line available, and that's a problem because how do you do poverty line? I mean, how do you do poverty estimations without an official poverty line? And since any poverty line that we basically took showed a very small headcount ratio, we thought maybe let's try to experiment with relative poverty lines. So, what relative poverty lines do is they benchmark poverty relative to whatever is the distribution of income at a point in time. So, as a society will get rich, naturally the relative poverty line would also kind of increase and capture that effect. So, that's what we were trying to kind of do here. And we use three lines in general. So the first is kind of our own assessment or our own kind of idea about it, where we try to use the 33rd percentile of consumption in India, and based on that, essentially what we do is we take a look at the consumption expenditures of the bottom 33% of the distribution and say let's have that as the poverty line, and on that basis we kind of calculate poverty estimates going all the way back to 2004. uh, so that's like the first thing, and the second thing we do is we take half of the mean income in the country. So let's say that the average income of the country was X. So we take X by 2 and define that as the poverty line. So as long as you earn more than half of the per capita national income, we consider you to be kind of non-poor. But if you earn less than that, we consider you to be poor. So we do those estimates, and we found that from 62% in 2011, it's come drastically down to 24.7, which is like 25%. So only a quarter people actually now earn less than half of the national income, which is quite impressive. And as you would kind of see, it's a significant improvement over a period of 12 years. And the third is really kind of benchmarking with European standards, where Europe defines it as 60% of the median income. So in that, what we do is we take the income distribution of the entire country, we find the income of the guy who's exactly at the middle of the distribution. So this person's income is such that half of the population earns more than him and half of the population earns less than him. And we take his income and multiply it with 60%, so zero point 0.6, and that gives us a poverty line that we kind of use to calculate uh, the poverty headcount ratio, and that also shows a steep decline from 53.7% to 16.5. And an advantage of some of these new poverty lines is that as the country will become richer, the poverty line will automatically update itself, and there would be no need for an official kind of expert group to come in and give us a poverty line. So this was really an exercise to kind of still try to update the poverty lines without actually having the expert group being formed to tell us what it should basically look like.
If we look at these numbers, these are significant numbers. Like, this is a gigantic reduction. This is not a minimalist reduction. Like,
Right.
by any standards,
Yeah.
these are gigantic reduction in that, and it can easily be backed up actually by table 4, right, where we have tracked the consumption patterns. I think we should share that too. I think the consumption pattern is equally important. This is also there.
Yeah. So you can see the bottom 30% is across the board witnessing a much higher increase in their consumption expenditures just between the last 2 years of the survey.
Hmm.
Just between 23 and 22, there's a 10% increase, 11% increase uh, for food and consumables. And then there's a 24% increase in consumption expenditures for durables. which is again amazing if you think about it, because as I said, there seems to be some saturation into how much households are willing to spend on food, and a lot of the incremental spending is actually coming now in consumer durables. So that's really your expanding middle class, which will now buy more air conditioners and stuff like that. So that's something at play in some sense over here. And I'm not surprised with these numbers. I mean, essentially, over the last decade, you have had a significant expansion of India's welfare state. So now you have, for example, a near universal food distribution program. There are cash transfers program being launched out in different parts of the country, which are kind of given by state governments. You have the national cash transfer program under PM Kisan, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the scale of redistribution that the government has done over the last decade, both the governments, even UPA and NDA, it's been significant. And because of those redistribution efforts, essentially you have seen a sharper increase at the bottom of the distribution rather than at the top.
Yeah. Another thing that was very interesting is Shamika had tweeted this out, where they had analyzed the time use data, and they found these facts that this was the time spent on employment related activities in India. This was the Prime Minister's Office working paper series. This is EAC-PM/WP/37/2025. This was January 2025. And four very interesting points were mentioned by Shamika in that Indians work similar hours to other emerging economies and significantly more than developed countries. Two, urban Indians in regular jobs at private public limited companies work most number of hours. Three, government employees work fewer hours than average Indians and significantly lesser than employees of private public limited companies. Four, among states, all northeastern states, Assam and Goa, work fewer hours. Five, working more hours is strongly correlated with higher per capita GDP. भाई अपना नारायण मूर्ति भाई तो बोलेगा, देखो मैंने तो तुम लोगों को बोला था, तुम लोग काम नहीं करते हो, काम करो सबके साथ.
So even before a paper came out last year in June, we had the labor force paper where we kind of looked at this issue of time use
Yeah.
survey. And what we found was much more interesting, because we, instead of taking just the gender binary, we started looking at household as a unit. So if you have a person who's married, essentially their decision to work, male and female, is not independent, it's taken together. And what we found is that typically men work much longer for market work and women work longer for non-market work. And if you take the average, Indians are not working any higher relative to any of the emerging market economies. It's the same. So if you take a look at like the female labor force participation rate, वो दिखता इंडिया में कम है, but if you take the labor force participation rate, that's on average comparable to any emerging market of India's in India's level, or comparable to India. And the reason is because women, when they do more non-market work, that allows more men to do market work. So really the way to kind of think about this uh, market versus non-market work and time spent working uh, is to treat the household as a unit rather than treat male and female as separately, and that there's a lot of literature of this even happening in the US, where people have found that typically men and women don't make their employment decisions independently. So I don't know why people kind of still look at gender binary here, whereas the appropriate frame would actually be to look at the household unit, since there's some dependence in the relationship. So let's say if I don't want to work, naturally someone in my family has to work so that I can stay at home, right? So my decision to not work versus someone in my family's decision to work is not totally independent. It's taken together. घर तो चलाना है basically.
Fair enough. I mean, I understand where you're coming from. Ki ghar to chalana. I think there are cultural nuances to this. I do agree with you. A lot of times, not just that. When you're single, your priorities are different. When you're married, your priorities are
Right.
different. When you are married without children, your priorities are different. When you're married with children, your priorities are different. Maybe you get a great job offer, but hey, guess what? The area where I'm getting a good job offer does not have a nice school for my
Right.
children. So would
So
I move and take the job offer?
so if you could pull up the labor force paper, there's a very nice chart over there where I have female labor force participation rate and time spent on childcare. So precisely on what you're saying. This, uh, if you want, I can probably. Can I share my screen?
Yeah, share your screen.
Okay,
यही
let
तो
me
है,
just.
you are allowed to share screen.
Okay, let me pull it up so that.
This is why, see, this is why these kinds of conversations are so much fun. And you know what hurts me, Karan?
Mhm.
We are the only ones who do these discussions
Yeah.
consistently in the entire Indian content space, mainstream and podcast. मैं अकेला येड़े के जैसे तुझे बुला बुला के डिस्कशन करता हूँ और लोगों को बुलाता हूँ और करता हूँ. It's so depressing that nobody in India actually wants to have policy discussions on this. I mean, to be fair to Amit Verma also does it in his own way, but उसका more है ना philosophy based discussion होता है. Amit doesn't look at current numbers and stuff like that, but I do appreciate Amit also doing that. But yeah, it's sad. Like, we should be having these kinds of discussions on a regular basis in India about that. This is what matters. तुझे पता नहीं वो न्यूज रिपोर्ट देखी कर्नाटका गवर्नमेंट ने क्या बोला?
नहीं.
मल्टीप्लेक्स के सिनेमा हॉल्स की टिकट को कैप लगा दे, 200 रुपए के ऊपर नहीं लगा सकते तुम.
Wow.
रुक जा, I'll share the news for you.
Yeah,
मैं
I'm
बोला मैं
send.
अकेला क्यों
Let
किया है तूने share?
nahi, because I'm using a single screen. I'm having some trouble. This is page
Don't worry.
76, last page. I sent you the link.
No, नहीं, I'm not able to download it. I'm not able to download it. मेरे को WhatsApp पे भेज दे. मेरे को WhatsApp पे भेज.
WhatsApp पे भेज देता
कोई
हूँ.
बात. WhatsApp पे भेज. In the meantime, let me share this
Yeah.
wonderful news with all our, viewers. This
So
was reported in
so
the.
it's also interesting ki what has happened historically is ki women were always more employed in household enterprises in rural areas.
Yeah,
So
I'm downloading your
2004.
labor paper.
So 2004 से 2011 में when a lot of people moved outside of rural areas,
So,
that
which page
household.
are we looking at in this paper?
Last page 76.
All right,
This was slightly
76.
this was more technical in nature, so that's why I guess uh,
ये तूने मेरे को भेजा नहीं था.
हाँ.
ये तूने मेरे को नहीं भेजा था. All right,
भेजा
we
था,
have
भेजा
it
था.
on the screen.
So can you zoom a little bit?
Sure, I will zoom even more.
Yeah, because these are like country codes, right? So what you have here is time spent on childcare on the y-axis, and then you have the
Okay.
labor force participation rate of females. So this is time spent by females. And वो देखो इंडिया कितना कोने में है.
बाप रे, इंडिया तो एक अलग ही दुनिया है.
So basically, and this is where like it's quite interesting to have this conversation, and not a lot of people are actually doing that, unfortunately. Even those who are analyzing FLPRs uh, are ignoring this fact that really, when women are spending more time on childcare, it's essentially a intergenerational transfer of human capital that's happening. So we need to kind of also ascertain whether the reason why women are spending more time on childcare is because they want to or because they can't find jobs. Matlab, those are two very separate issues.
No,
But
this is a very good point you've raised. This is a societal discussion, right? This is a
right,
societal discussion that we need to have. That it's not whether women need to do this or men need to do this. I would frame it like this: what is more healthy for a society, that if, let's say, a family reaches a state where they can, they have financial stability, then if one of the parents decides to stay at home, is that a good thing or a bad thing for the children? And can we do an objective analysis of that? And what are the benefits to the society vis-a-vis both the parents working and doing that? I'm not saying which one is good or which one is bad. I am, before somebody starts to say that I want my society to go one way or the other, I'm not saying that. uh, uh, the the point is that these things are very important, and we need to talk about these things, that when we do these kinds of discussions, like in India, are women being forced to stay at home? Are all women staying at home? Are they being told to stay at home? Are they being given a choice to stay at home? There are many questions that should be
Right.
asked, and I don't think they're being asked. And it's only fair. But for those people who are thinking कि मैंने ऐसे ही गप लगा दी थी um, वो कर्नाटका की आर्टिकल की, I just
Hmm.
look at how the media has framed this article. Huh? That is what I wanted to show you. Economic
So,
Times title क्या है? Good news for Karnataka movie lovers as state sets rupees 200 cap on tickets even in multiplexes.
yeah, मैं कहाँ से start करूँ? You've seen that now we are also making canteens for samosas in airports, right? State canteens. So,
ये नहीं मैंने
uh,
न्यूज पढ़ी, रुक जा, ये तो मेरे को देखनी पड़ेगी.
so Raghav Chadda basically spoke in the Parliament House saying कि भाई बहुत महंगी कॉफी है, वहाँ पे जनता कैंटीन खोलो प्लीज एयरपोर्ट पे, कि भाई 5 रुपए की चाय और 10 रुपए का समोसा मिले, समथिंग टू दैट इफेक्ट.
अच्छा.
So I mean, like, I keep wondering कि why are we, like, again getting back into that zone कि सरकार सब कुछ करे भाई. 4,000 5,000 की टिकट खरीद सकते हो तो मतलब डू यू वांट 5 10 20 रुपए का सब्सिडाइज चाय समोसा, मतलब लाइक लुक अफोर्डेबिलिटी इज एन
ये है ना जिसने,
अफोर्डेबिलिटी.
ये है ना उसने ओटीटी से पैसे खाए हैं. अच्छा ये पढ़. To promote Kannada films, the state will create its own OTT platform. This decision comes after leading Kannada actor producers like Rakshit Shetty and Rishabh Shetty raised concerns that major streaming platforms were not showing enough interest in Kannada content. Oh भाई, अभी OTT बनेगा स्टेट गवर्नमेंट का. बस और कुछ नहीं रह गया था इस देश में. ये यही रह गया था इस देश में. हमने ये भी देख लिया. So try the level of Current, the level of economic illiteracy in this great country of ours, the Vishwa Guru that we are, is so high that matlab, the less I say, the better, because we are all such a confused lot, that, and the amount of economic illiteracy in India, right, amongst the political class, amongst the bureaucratic class, amongst all of the people in general, is uh, is actually very dangerous. Is actually very dangerous.
Yeah.
In fact, in that chart you showed me, India was so far up, मुझे उसको ढूंढने में टाइम लगी क्योंकि सारी दुनिया इधर थी और इंडिया एक आउटलायर था उधर एक कोने में बैठा हुआ. मेरे को दिख नहीं रहा था इंडिया किधर है 2 सेकंड के लिए.
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time on time use surveys on FLPR. हमने देखा कि labor movement कहाँ हो रहा है. So even for women who are working rural and urban areas में what was going on. Incidentally, rural areas में women work a lot more than urban areas because again household enterprises में बहुत ज़्यादा था movement. And then we spent a lot of time to kind of understand why was that happening and what explains the recent increase in female labor force participation rate. And turns out education बढ़ रहा है, so a lot of those dynamics are also at play now, which is making things a bit better. But as a society, you cannot really say कि they should work more and at the same time they should also do more of non-market work. So in some sense 24 घंटे हैं सबके पास काम करने के लिए, उसमें से आप अगर 10 घंटे नॉन मार्केट वर्क करोगे तो आप मार्केट वर्क नहीं कर सकते. So some burden of the non-market work, whether that's childcare, household activities, elderly care, that has to be borne by other members of the family. And only when something like that actually happens can you have a situation where where reasonably, you can encourage more women to work, if that's the objective of the state.
Fair enough. चलो अभी questions लेते हैं. Is Karnataka government becoming more communist? I can answer. Karan will not. Yes. Okay. Report by Bloom Ventures is 1 billion Indians have no power to spend on non-essential items. Growth is driven by productivity investment. Productivity of Indian labor is very low. Investment is not growing. Are we entering the middle income trap?
We are already in a lower middle income country. I think our growth is relatively decent. I don't think that the report that they have, is very accurate in terms of reflecting what's happening in the economy. Uh, National surveys that are kind of fairly representative do tell you that there is some capacity of spending beyond basic needs created even at the bottom of the distribution. uh, Productivity is a big challenge, was a challenge 10 years back, continues to remain as a challenge. And the reason it's a challenge is again why investments don't kind of boost productivity. To make a worker productive, I need to kind of spend some capital on that worker, and that means I need to make some investments in India. But there are a lot of reasons why that's not happening, and we can of course have a separate conversation which can last hours about why that's not happening. uh, but we cannot solve the productivity problem unless we realistically assess कि कितना ज्यादा पावर स्टेट के पास हमने दे दिया है.
Okay. All right. Next question was, does the act of targeting comfy people at this earlier stage to reduce inequality not have future implications on GDP growth?
I don't think that there's any targeting of comfy people at any. That's not what's happening. It's just what's playing out is just dynamics of Indian labor market, uh, where you have too many people with diplomas and degrees without much skills, and therefore there's a sorting problem that's happening, which is kind of driving these results. Uh, I think that the tax cut would, in some sense, also kind of help the comfy people, or at least some segment of the comfy people, get a breather for a bit. Uh, but yeah, I don't think that there's a targeting that's actually happening towards any particular section of the society. What has happened though is that the state has made a decision to spend a lot more on the bottom part of the distribution over the last decade. And those expenditures, those redistribution expenditures, have clearly had a big impact. And now we are at
Okay.
that limit कि कितना कितना कर सकते हो. You're really at the limit at how much you can even spend on redistribution. So now we have free bus rides and stuff like that.
Yeah. I think eventually सब कुछ ही फ्री कर दो इस देश में, सब कुछ फ्री. और अंबानी को बोलो ये देश को चलाए, सारा पैसा हमको दे दे, बस अंबानी चलाएगा ये देश और मिडिल क्लास भाग जाएगा इस देश से. योर टेक ऑन द न्यू इनकम टैक्स बिल. अब आईटी ऑफिसर इंस्टा फेसबुक भी देखेंगे, वो तो वैसे भी आईएएस वालों के प्रोफाइल में. Okay. I think Ajay has clarified this, so let me put up Ajay Roti's tweet up. So the move aligns taxation powers with technological advancements, ensuring the virtual digital assets such as cryptocurrencies do not escape scrutiny. Tax expert Ajay Roti, founder Tax Compass, said, "This is not a privacy issue. Strictly speaking, IT officials cannot randomly gain access to your emails or social media accounts. They can do so only if they have reasons to believe that you are concealing any income and after obtaining approvals from joint or chief commissioners. And mind you, they can take this action even now to prevent litigation by individuals who may claim that the virtual space is their virtual personal space. A clarification has been added under the provisions of the new income tax bill.
Can I
The
come?
provision around एक मिनट मैं पूरा पढ़ लूं. The provision around virtual digital space has been introduced under the section that pertains to search and seizure procedures. No official can simply walk into your house and ask you to show jewelry unless they have reliable information about undisclosed income. If you refuse to open your cupboard, they can break open the lock, say roti. Under Section 132, the approval of an officer above the rank of Joint Commissioner is needed to conduct such operations. Likewise, the officials cannot override your access codes without presenting a strong case for suspected tax evasion, following the set procedure and obtaining necessary approvals, he added. Sounds good on paper. I don't trust the state, is my
Yeah,
answer.
no, एग्जैक्टली लाइक ऑफिसर को रीजनेबल बिलीव चाहिए. मेरे को लगता है कि भाई कुशल इज इवेडिंग टैक्सेस, चलो घर पे चलते हैं उसके, लेट्स स्कैन हिज व्हाट्सएप चैट्स, लेट्स ओपन हिज ईमेल. मतलब दिस इज हाउ अ बनाना रिपब्लिक इज रन. Essentially, how can my boss, who's also a tax officer, issue what would be a warrant for search and seizure? The fact that this was allowed under the existing law is itself questionable. This
Yeah,
right should actually be with a judge, not that our judges but in any civilized society they would have this power, and not the tax officers, because this can lead to this can really lead to a lot of harassment and organized chaos. And what people don't realize is, right now you may not do it when you're in power, but it's equally possible that somebody else may come to power tomorrow, and he may use these exact same provisions to harass anyone and everyone he deems as a challenger. So giving too much power in the hands of state, while it's good when you are the state, it's never good when you're on the other side. So
absolutely.
what we have is like this complete sense of uh, denialism of this reality that political cycles are temporary, and essentially you don't do something that you don't want to be done to you later on. So just have a sense of uh, individual rights and civil liberties in mind when you kind of make these provisions. I really thought that the new tax code would take away some of these arbitrary powers away, and basically make it a more progressive system in line with standard practice elsewhere. But turns out that we are really enamored by this idea of trying to build a surveillance state.
I think the biggest problem with the Indian mind is that Indians think that the state is benevolent.
It's
I'm
not.
just saying it,
Yeah. I mean,
exploitative.
yeah,
It's parasitic. It's blood
yeah.
sucking. This is my problem on the free speech issue. This is my problem on the taxation issue. Indians have a fundamental misunderstanding of what freedom is. Indians do not understand freedom conceptually. They are so obsessed with top down authoritarianism. They are so used to it because you go from a monarchical religious society to a semi democratic religious authoritarian society. That's all the transition that Indians have seen. That's all they have seen. They just don't understand freedom at a conceptual level. They don't want to understand freedom at a conceptual level. If somebody tries to tell them, bhai, tere haath mein le le hak, they almost lose their collective shit. They're like, मेरे को सोचना पड़ेगा और किसको सोचना पड़ेगा तुझे ही
Well,
सोचने का काम है.
I would rather have the state work on judicial capacity and give some of these powers to judges who, again, are defenders of uh, civil liberties, rather than the state opening Janta cafes in airports to give subsidized chai and samosa to people of India. That's not what the government is supposed to do. That's not what the state is supposed to do. But somehow we think we want that muft ka yeah, sasta sa samosa and chai, rather than pay for food at an airport, and we are okay with surrendering our civil liberties in exchange for that.
They don't even know what civil liberties are, is my contention. I
Right.
think they don't know. They think they're the amount of times you listen to ड्यूटीज की बात क्यों नहीं करता कोई है ये
So
ड्यूटीज ऑब्सेस सोसाइटी है.
I'll go a step even further. इंडिया ने टैक्स पे चार्टर का अनाउंसमेंट करा था. आई थॉट इट वाज अ ब्रिलियंट आइडिया, होना चाहिए. एंड देन आई लुक्ड एट द आईआरएस का टैक्स चार्टर, ब्रिलियंट, की मतलब लाइक दिस इज व्हाट द आईआरएस इज कमिटेड टू डू. एंड देन रिसेंटली मैंने इंडिया का टैक्स चार्टर देखा. पहला पार्ट बिल्कुल सही कि टैक्स डिपार्टमेंट ब्ला 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 मदरहुड स्टेटमेंट्स कि भाई हरास नहीं करेगा ये वगैरह करेंगे, बट वो बोल रहे हैं कि नहीं करेंगे तो मान जाओ कि नहीं करेंगे. एंड उसके नीचे एंड द टैक्स पेयर कमिट्स टू, तो टैक्स पेयर की ड्यूटी भी आपने टैक्स पेयर के चार्टर में डाल दी, which is so ridiculous because the only reason you had a taxpayer charter was because you wanted to create certain kind of rights for the taxpayer, and उन rights के अंदर आपने duties भी डाल दिया, which does not make any sense, and those rights are also not justiciable in court.
Yeah,
So for
it is
example,
ridiculous.
if the tax department harasses me, I cannot go and file a case in court and say that they are harassing me
Yeah,
and
yeah,
seek punitive damages.
yeah. You're guilty until proven innocent.
Yeah.
That's it's just it's
So
an insane system, and the average Indian just doesn't know. You know why? Because there are not enough haves in India. The day and the haves in India are also the typical uncle auntie mindset haves of India. समझ रहा है? They are all uncle auntie mindset वाले लोग. They are so comfortable with the state being their mummy papa. And I don't know why we like so many mummy papas. एक
yeah.
काफी नहीं है क्या तुमको? दादा दादी है, नाना नानी है, चाचा चाची है, ताया ताई है, फूफा फूफी है, मम्मी पापा है, और अभी स्टेट को भी ला रहे हो उसमें. मतलब तुम लोग को चैन नहीं है सालो, चैन नहीं है इनको. It's ridiculous. I don't agree with this कि अरे स्टेट को ये करना है वो करना है. नहीं, the state cannot be made so powerful, and India's bane is that ये चीज पे आउटरीच नहीं होती. कभी भी आपके इंटरफेरेंस ऑफ द स्टेट रिलेटेड सब्जेक्ट पे आउटरीच नहीं होती. एक और क्वेश्चन किसी ने पूछा है, दिस इज रिलेटेड टू, आई read somewhere that the western job market has been adjusted to dual earning in a household. Now if someone wants to just raise children, they can't. What do you think about it?
I don't think that uh, I don't think that that's true. If people want to raise children, they still can and they do. Uh, yes, of course, there is this rise in double income households in general, and the cost of raising children has gone up. But that's not the reason why you don't have too many children, and that's a very open-ended question. But essentially, what people feel is key women don't want to have children because it interferes with their career growth, and there's a motherhood penalty and some of those things. So historically, if you think about it, the way we define work, childcare is not considered as work. We define work as wage work, and we have kind of encouraged more and more women to participate in the labor force. Started with the Second World War when there were labor shortages and so on and so forth. So those structures of what is work, what is not work, what is expected and what is not expected from gender norms and social norms, etc., changed around that period. uh, and because of those social norms and mindset, probably now you have a situation where fertility rates are in a decline in not just Western world but uh, also in East Asia. South Korea and Japan are prime examples of this. Also happening in India, you have many states which are approaching below replacement levels of fertility. Even in 2011 census, we were just at the replacement rate of fertility, which means that we weren't having as many children to keep up with the population's decline due to aging and other related issues. So in some sense, if you really want to understand why there are so few children that are being born now, you have to take a very comprehensive historical perspective and try to understand this from the mind space of modern day women, which is something that neither me nor Kushal can do. So you do need more female scholars to actually study this issue and help us understand what's really going on there.
Hmm. Anything else you think we could not cover?
नहीं यार, but that जनता cafe thing is really annoying.
सस्ती चाय पी खुश रहे.
So you should see कि क्या होता है. अभी आपके एयरपोर्ट पे भी आने वाला है बॉम्बे में. So ट्राई करना चाय कॉफी कैसा है समोसे के साथ.
कुछ नहीं कर सकते इस
let me know let me know समोसा गरम था या ठंडा था तो माइक्रोवेव करके वो सौगी वाला दिया.
हाँ, मैं जाके ट्राई करूंगा। समोसा क्या मतलब, आई कुछ बोल नहीं सकता, मुझे कुछ बोलना नहीं है। मुझे कुछ बोलना नहीं है। एनीवेज चलो वील।
सो वंस यूर हेयर तब बोल लेना।
हाँ, गालियां ही देने का मन करता है। गाली निकलेगा।
It's amazing that you can make so much progress on a lot of issues related to abject poverty, etc., in a very short span of time. But at the same time, you see a reversal of the things that kind of made such widespread prosperity possible.
Hmm.
So, well, yeah, it's a very it's an enigma in its own self, right? Like you can have the two opposite extremes being true at the same time in India, and that, of course, is
Yeah,
the
yeah.
fascinating part of India.
It is truly a fascinating part of India. As they say in India, uh, it is, yeah, two things are equally true for India, because India
Mm,
is such a confusing society where you have stories of heroism and stories that could, you know, make you go crazy. Stories of free markets and stories of batshit crazy socialism.
right.
India just keeps growing irrespective of it. But anyways, guys, once again, I would recommend each and every one of you to download this paper and read it. I have attached the link to download the paper in the description of the podcast. I've also kept Karan's X handle in the description of the podcast, so you should go follow him and download the paper. If you have any questions, you can ask him further questions on X. If Karan checks them, he can answer them. You can also, support the Cārvāka podcast by joining the membership on YouTube or on Patreon. This is the only way this podcast runs, through monthly memberships that you guys give to us over here, which runs the show. So do consider joining the membership program. If you want to send one-time donations, you can send it on UPI through kushalmehra at ICICI, through Interac Canada, to the email kushalmehra81@gmail.com. If you want to buy Cārvāka podcast merchandise, you can go on Kadak Merch, order over there, or you can go on kushalmehra.com. You can buy my book Nastic on Amazon too. The link is there in the description. If you don't want to do any of that, just like this video, subscribe to the Cārvāka podcast YouTube channel, leave a rating in your preferred audio platform. And if you want to love the Indian state or abuse the Indian state, do share your views in the comment section. We will pass them on to the government of India. Anyways, until then, namaste, take care, bye bye.